Imagine a mayoral race where the headlines aren't just about, current crime stats or policy plans. Instead, they're deeply tangled up with colonial history, centuries old, and some really radical ideas about power. It's a fascinating, complex picture.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
That's right. We're taking a deep dive into the heart of New York City's very intense public safety debate right now. Our mission, as always, is to pull out the most surprising facts and the crucial insights from the source material we've looked at, helping you understand the full picture, really, what's truly at stake beyond the sort of day-to-day news cycle.
Yeah, and our jumping off point for this dive is, unfortunately, two very recent, very tragic events that have really shaken New York. First, the Midtown Manhattan mass shooting on July 28th, 2025. 4 people killed, including NYPD officer Diderul Islam, and then the Brooklyn Lounge shooting on August 17th, just recently. 12 victims, 3 fatalities there.
Awful events. And they've absolutely ignited this debate among the mayoral candidates. It's revealing these really deep ideological divides that, as our sources show, have roots reaching far beyond just the city itself.
Exactly. So to really unpack this, we need to start with a pretty powerful, maybe even unsettling idea, this concept of domestic colonies. And the police acting as an occupying force. Where does that come from?
Well, the material we reviewed traces it back. It looks at how calls for police reform evolved, especially after, say, the 2012 murder of Trayvon Martin and the 2014 murder of Mike Brown. Our sources explain how what maybe started as these urban rebellions, raw, spontaneous anger shifted into more organized mass mobilizations that were specifically targeting what they called police terrorism.
Right, and this seems to be where the movement took a really critical turn. It wasn't just about being against something anymore. It started clearly saying what it was fighting for. And that goal was Black community control over police.
Precisely. And we need to be clear, this isn't about minor tweaks or, small reforms. The sources really emphasize this is a vision for fundamental systemic change.
Okay, so what are the core principles behind that vision?
They're quite radical, as you said. The sources lay out a human right to informed consent and self-determination when it comes to state violence. And that extends to demanding, and this is a direct quote, democratic community control over the organs of the state, granted the consent of the governed to carry arms, deny people their freedom, and even kill. So basically, community control over the police.
Wow. That's comprehensive.
It is. And what's also notable is the strong emphasis in the sources that leadership for this kind of movement should come from low-income Black women, queer, and trans folks, really advocating for what we'd call an intersectional approach.
It's interesting, too, how the sources distinguish between root issues and surface issues. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. The argument presented is that things we often focus on, like individual racial prejudice or even historical things like Jim Crow laws, are actually surface issues.
Right.
So, for instance, Jim Crow laws were abolished, right? But segregation didn't just vanish. It persisted. It morphed into new surface issues, like mass incarceration, which Michelle Alexander famously called the new Jim Crow.
Okay, I see. So the surface problems change, but the underlying issue remains.
That's the core argument. And here's the really provocative part from the sources. They state that racial prejudice is not the problem. They argue, and I'm quoting again, prejudice sentiments themselves are absolutely irrelevant to our lives unless coupled with the power to implement those sentiments.
So prejudice without power is just a thought.
Essentially, yes. According to this view, it's the power that makes it harmful on a societal level.
So if individual bias isn't the root cause, what is, according to these sources?
The root problem, they contend, is this. Black communities are effectively domestic colonies in the United States, and the police serve as an occupying force in those communities. It's a very strong metaphor. It compares the police to an army maintaining control not necessarily for the community's safety, but to protect the property, economic interests, and social superiority of the metropole.
The metropole meaning?
Yeah.
Like the dominant society. Businesses, corporate interests.
Exactly. Businesses, corporate profits, and what the sources term white middle-class sensibilities of the wider society.
And this idea isn't actually brand new, is it?
Not at all. And that's what's striking. Our sources point back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his 1967 speeches like, "Where do we go from here?" And the 3 evils of society, he explicitly said, the ghetto is a domestic colony. And he called for a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
That really reframes it, puts it right in the lineage of the civil rights movement. So given this diagnosis, this root issue of domestic colonialism, what's the proposed cure?
The solution put forward is these civilian police control boards, or CPCBs, described as civilian boards comprised of residents subject to police jurisdiction with 100% complete authority over the priorities, policies, and practices of the police.
Okay, 100% complete authority. That's a lot of power. How would these board members be chosen? This sounds crucial.
It is, and this is maybe the most controversial part detailed in the sources. Not through elections. Instead, they propose random selection from resident pools. Things like voter registration lists, maybe driver's license databases.
Random selection. Why not elections?
The argument presented is that random selection is needed to avoid what the sources call the dysfunction and corruption of the U.S. electoral process. They claim elections often disenfranchise the very communities most affected by policing. So random selection is seen as more truly democratic in reflecting the policed population.
That's certainly a different take on democracy. What kind of powers would these randomly selected boards actually have?
According to the sources, incredibly broad powers. Establishing police priorities, setting all department policies, everything from uniforms to use of force rules, and critically, the power to hire and fire individual police officers.
Hire and fire. So ultimate accountability rests with this civilian board.
That's the idea. The sources argue that even if, hypothetically, a racist cop were hired, the community's power through the CPCB would make their personal racism moot. Because the system, the power structure, would be controlled by the community. It disarms the impact of prejudice.
It really hammers home that point about power versus just sentiment.
Absolutely. And this approach, it explicitly rejects the more traditional models, things like civilian review boards, oversight committees, even standard community policing. Those are seen as just reforms, tinkering around the edges, failing to actually shift the underlying power dynamic.
And the sources are pretty blunt about it.
Very blunt. A direct quote. There is no purpose or dignity in reforming a colonial relationship. The only option is to end that relationship. It's a call for, well, abolition of the current structure, not reform.
A truly radical stance. Okay, so to understand why someone would view policing through this colonial lens, why use that specific loaded term, our sources suggest we need to look deeper into the history of political violence and colonialism itself.
Exactly. It's a challenging connection, but the sources argue it's crucial. They reference the academic Mahmoud Mamdani, no relation, we should note, to the mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani we'll discuss later. Mahmoud Mamdani's work critiques explanations of political violence that just blame culture or theology. He says, no, you have to look at the history, particularly the legacy of colonialism.
And he connects this even to events like the Holocaust.
He does, building on thinkers like Hannah Arendt. Arendt argued the Holocaust shouldn't be seen in isolation. She situated it within this longer, awful history of settler genocide of the native. Arendt wrote that modern genocide was nurtured in the colonies. The sources give examples: the elimination of Hottentot tribes, the horrors in the Congo under Belgian rule, where the population apparently plummeted from maybe 40 million down to 8 million, just staggering numbers.
Truly chilling. And there was a distinction made in how wars were fought.
Yes, the sources describe this European habit by the 20th century, a clear line between civilized wars fought between European powers with rules and colonial wars. In colonial wars, it was argued that the laws of nature applied, justifying the extermination of lower races. A stark example cited is WWII. Germany generally followed laws of war against Western powers, but not against Russia. The result: 57% of Soviet POWs, 3.3 million people, died in captivity.
Unbelievable brutality.
And here's a really horrific detail from the sources connecting the colonial to the European. The first genocide of the 20th century was the German annihilation of the Hero people in Southwest Africa. And it was there that a German geneticist, Eugene Fischer, did his first medical experiments on the science of race mixing. His student, Joseph Mengele, later infamous for the gas chambers at Auschwitz.
My goodness, that's a direct line.
A direct, horrifying line. The sources quote, "The Holocaust was the imperial chickens coming home to roost." The idea being that the methods and ideologies developed in the colonies were eventually turned back onto Europe. Post-colonial thinkers like Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon made this exact point, that Hitler applied colonial practices in Europe.
That's a profoundly disturbing way to reframe that history. Mamdani also talks about how group identities are formed by the state, right? Legal and historical projects.
Yes, he discusses how victims and perpetrators become polarized as group identities, often shaped by the state. Think about colonial Africa and the difference between direct rule and indirect rule. Under indirect rule, the colonizers deliberately used things like censuses to break down a single native identity. They created multiple, smaller, ethnicized minority identities called tribes. It was a divide-and-rule strategy, essentially.
And this had legal consequences.
Huge legal consequences. Generally, races like Europeans fell under a single civil law system, implying they shared a common future. But tribes, the natives, were governed by separate, customary laws. The message, as the sources interpret it, was clear. Different races were meant to have a common future, different ethnicities were not. Keep them separate, keep them manageable.
And Rwanda is presented as a key case study here.
A tragic one, yes. Before Belgian colonialism, Hutu and Tutsi identities were apparently more fluid. Sources mention processes like Kwihutura, where a successful Hutu could, over time, become recognized as Tutsi. But the Belgians racialized these categories. They legally defined Hutu as Bantu and Tutsi as Hamites, making them fixed, distinct identities based on, well, racist pseudoscience.
Which had devastating consequences later on.
Absolutely. Mamdani argues the 1994 genocide wasn't just top-down, it was a social project with mass participation. His book, When Victims Become Killers, tries to understand the humanity of the perpetrators. Not to excuse the killing, obviously, but to make the horror thinkable. To understand the context that allowed it. The Civil War, 1990-94, sparked by returning Tutsi exiles, led to the rise of radical Hutu power. They painted Tutsi as foreign aliens, not truly Rwandan, and this was fueled by large-scale displacement of Hutu populations during the war.
So the legacy is this terrifying link.
Exactly. The link between organization of genocidal violence from the summit of political power linked to mass participation on the ground. History creating the conditions for mass violence.
It's a powerful, sobering lesson from history. Okay, let's bring this back to the present day, back to New York City. We need to connect these complex, heavy ideas to the current political landscape, specifically mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani. The sources identify him as a democratic socialist, and his stance on policing, particularly defund the police, has definitely evolved.
It certainly has. Back in 2020, the sources note, he was openly calling to cut funding to the NYPD. There was an incident where he apparently mocked a crying officer, attributing the tears to the public's justified frustration at the murder of George Floyd. He also suggested back then that domestic violence calls, they'd be far better handled by people trained to deal with those specific situations as opposed to an individual with a gun.
But that's not his message now.
No, he has explicitly walked back that defund rhetoric. He's quoted publicly stating, "I am not defunding the police. I am not running to defund the police." Clear statement. However, his current proposals, while avoiding the defund label, still seem to resonate with that community control idea we discussed.
Alpha.
He's proposing a new Department of Community Safety. The idea is this department would handle non-crime 911 calls, think mental health crises, issues related to homelessness, and it would use social workers and other non-police professionals, even mentioning things like transit ambassadors instead of armed officers for those situations.
Which sounds like communities defining and delivering safety in a different way.
Exactly. And he's proposing a massive funding increase for a 275% increase in community safety funding.
Okay. And how are his political opponents reacting to this shift or these current proposals?
Well, as you can probably guess, the reactions are strong. Incumbent Mayor Eric Adams himself, a former NYPD captain, calls Mamdani's proposals irresponsible and reckless. Straightforward opposition. And former Governor Andrew Cuomo weighed in too, calling Mamdani's public safety stance abhorrent and wholly disconnected from any responsible government approach. Cuomo actually advocated for the opposite, increasing the number of NYPD officers by about 5,000.
Quite the contrast. Any other critiques?
Yes. The Republican candidate Curtis Sliwa also jumped in. He blames Cuomo, saying Cuomo's pro-criminal laws created this mess, but then adds that Mamdani's radical agenda would only make it worse. So you see this deep, deep division on how to approach public safety.
Definitely. What about Mamdani's stance on gun control? That's always a hot topic.
It is. He supports a federal ban on assault rifles, which aligns him with the current governor, Kathy Hochul. And his voting record, according to our sources, shows he's repeatedly voted for the most restrictive gun laws in the state legislature. Things like requiring social media disclosure for people buying firearms, mandating licenses for semi-automatic firearms. Pretty strong anti-gun record.
What about Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA that he's part of?
Well, the sources note the official DSA platform calls for a potential 28th Amendment to repeal the Second Amendment entirely, allowing only manually loaded firearms. But the sources add a crucial caveat. Individually signed posts do not necessarily reflect the views of DSA as an organization or its leadership. So organizational stance versus individual member views.
Okay. But his personal stance and record seem clear. Has there been pushback on that?
Yes, quite a bit, focused on what critics call clear hypocrisy. Our sources highlight his recent wedding, which took place in Uganda. Now, Uganda has much stricter gun laws than the U.S., but also, reportedly, one of the highest rates of gun violence. And photos apparently showed Mamdani clearly surrounded by armed guards at his own wedding.
Ah, so the critique is he advocates for restrictions here, but utilizes armed security himself elsewhere.
Precisely. It feeds that narrative of politicians wanting one set of rules for the public and another for themselves. Critics use this to argue that strict bans, like those in Uganda, or even in France where the Nice attack happened despite strong laws, don't actually stop criminals determined to get weapons.
That taps into a broader debate, doesn't it? Even among liberals or left-leaning voters.
It does. The sources mention frustration from liberal gun owners who feel alienated by strong Democratic anti-gun stances. They point to examples like Beto O'Rourke in Texas, arguing that kind of rhetoric might actually hurt candidates in certain areas. There's also the legal argument that extreme gun control will be found unconstitutional eventually.
Though the counter is that lawsuits take time.
Right. Litigation takes years, during which restrictive laws remain in effect. And locally, the point is made that NYC already has strict gun laws anyway.
Right.
So a mayor's individual stance might not change much on the ground immediately. The sources even point to internal debates within leftist liberal circles about these kinds of purity tests on issues like guns. So it's complex even within political alignments.
It really is. This whole deep dive, it just reveals such a striking tension. On one side, you have these really profound academic arguments framing policing through the lens of colonial history, demanding truly radical change like civilian control. And on the other side, you have the reality of a candidate like Zohran Mamdani trying to navigate these ideas in a real-world election, balancing that past rhetoric, his current proposals, and then facing all this scrutiny over his personal actions and perceived, well, inconsistencies.
Absolutely. And for you, the listener, we hope this exploration goes beyond just the next NYC election or another policy fight. It's really about understanding how these deep historical currents, these legacies of injustice, can shape the challenges we face today, how they influence the very language we use to talk about safety, community, and power.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, drawn from our sources. If the core argument is that individual racism isn't the fundamental problem, but rather the power held by systems to implement racist ideas, what would it actually mean for our society to genuinely shift that power? And, perhaps more pointedly, are we truly prepared for the kind of profound changes that might actually involve? Something to think about.